You know what's strange about American power? For decades, the world's strongest military, largest economy, most powerful alliances, and yet in the past few years, rivals have been making moves they would never have attempted before. Not because America's military got weaker, not because the economy collapsed, but because something more fundamental shifted. And that shift exposed a vulnerability that's harder to defend against than any missile system or cyber attack. So what does that actually mean? What kind of weakness can neutralize the world's most powerful military without firing a shot? The answer isn't in hardware or technology, it's in something far more basic: the ability to make and execute strategic decisions consistently over time. And that's precisely what America's rivals have learned to exploit. To understand this, we need to look at how American power actually functioned for most of the post-World War II era. The system wasn't just about having the biggest military or the strongest economy, it was about predictability. Allies knew America would honor commitments. Rivals knew there were clear red lines. The system worked because both friends and adversaries could calculate American responses with reasonable accuracy. That predictability created stability, even during crises. This predictability came from a specific domestic political architecture. There was disagreement, certainly, sometimes fierce disagreement, about tactics and priorities, but on fundamental questions of national interest and strategic positioning, there existed a bipartisan consensus. The Senate ratified treaties with overwhelming majorities. Defense policy survived administration changes. Alliance commitments remained stable, regardless of which party controlled the White House. This wasn't because Americans agreed on everything. It was because there were certain foundational questions that sat outside partisan combat. That consensus created a feedback loop. Because strategic policy was stable, allies made long-term commitments based on American promises. Because allies were reliable, American power projection became more effective. Because rivals faced a consistent adversary, they adjusted their behavior accordingly. The system reinforced itself. But here's what most people miss about this architecture. It wasn't natural. It was constructed deliberately after World War II, maintained through institutional norms, and sustained by a shared memory of what happened when America retreated into isolation. The consensus existed because enough people in both parties remembered the cost of getting it wrong. Now consider the scale of commitments built on this foundation. America maintains formal defense treaties with more than 50 countries. It has troops deployed in approximately 150 countries. Its alliance system encompasses roughly 60% of global GDP. These aren't just military arrangements. They're economic, technological, and political interdependencies. Countries restructured their entire defense postures based on American guarantees. They made decades-long investments in interoperability. They forewent developing certain capabilities because America promised to provide them. This created a massive overhang of commitments and expectations, and all of it was built on the assumption that the underlying political system, that ability to make and honor long-term strategic decisions, would remain functional. But something changed, and it didn't happen overnight. The erosion started gradually, then accelerated. The bipartisan foreign policy consensus began fracturing in the 2000s. Iraq war debates created lasting divisions. The financial crisis of 2008 shifted domestic priorities. Different parties started viewing America's global role through fundamentally incompatible frameworks. By the 2016 election, what had once been tactical disagreements had become existential questions. Should America even maintain its alliance system? Are these commitments assets or liabilities? The fracturing didn't just affect policy debates, it affected the institutional machinery itself. Treaties stopped getting ratified. Confirmations for key positions faced months or years of delays. Budgets became continuing resolutions rather than strategic plans. Each administration began using executive authority more aggressively because legislative consensus had become impossible. And critically, allies and rivals both noticed that American commitments might not survive the next election cycle. This created a new dynamic. Traditional deterrence assumes your adversary believes you'll follow through on threats. But what happens when even your own allies aren't certain? What happens when rivals can simply wait out an administration, knowing policy might reverse completely in 4 years? The breakdown isn't just political polarization in the abstract. It manifests in specific, exploitable patterns. When a president makes a commitment, rivals immediately calculate, will Congress fund it? Will the next president honor it? Can we outlast the current policy by simply waiting? This turns every American strategic decision into a negotiation not just with foreign powers, but with America's own future political configuration. Consider what this looks like from Beijing or Moscow's perspective. They're not facing a unified adversary with a coherent long-term strategy. They're facing a system where major policy reversals happen every 4 to 8 years, where one administration negotiates a climate agreement, the next withdraws. Where one administration deepens alliances, the next questions their value. Where defense priorities shift not based on strategic assessment, but on which party controls which branch of government. This creates predictable windows of opportunity. If you're a rival power, you don't need to win a direct confrontation. You just need to identify the gaps, the moments when American policy is in transition, when new administrations are finding their footing, when domestic politics make decisive action difficult. You make moves during these windows, then consolidate gains before the next policy shift. The economic dimension amplifies this problem. America's fiscal situation increasingly constrains strategic options. The national debt has grown from roughly 35% of GDP in 2007 to over 120% today. Servicing that debt consumes an ever larger portion of the federal budget. This creates a direct trade-off. Money spent on interest payments can't be spent on defense, infrastructure, or maintaining alliance commitments. And crucially, this fiscal pressure makes every foreign commitment a domestic political fight about budget priorities. So rivals face a system where American responses are both unpredictable in direction and constrained in magnitude. You can't necessarily predict what America will do, but you can predict what it increasingly can't do. Sustain costly commitments indefinitely, launch expensive interventions, or maintain multiple theaters of operation simultaneously without domestic political backlash. The military dimension reveals another layer. American military superiority remains real, but applying that superiority requires political will and sustained commitment. Modern military operations aren't battles, they're campaigns that unfold over years. They require consistent funding, clear objectives, and domestic support that survives casualties and setbacks. But in a politically fractured system, that sustained commitment becomes questionable. Rivals have learned to exploit this. They don't challenge American power directly. That's still too risky. Instead, they operate in gray zones where American responses face maximum domestic political resistance. Cyber attacks that don't quite meet the threshold for military response. Economic coercion that doesn't trigger formal security guarantees. Gradual territorial expansion that happens too slowly to justify the domestic political cost of intervention. Each individual move seems manageable, but collectively they erode the credibility of American commitments. The information environment accelerates this dynamic. Rivals don't just exploit America's political divisions, they actively amplify them. Foreign disinformation campaigns don't need to create divisions. They just need to widen existing ones. They make every foreign policy debate more toxic, every alliance commitment more controversial, every military engagement more politically divisive. This creates a vicious cycle where external adversaries profit from internal dysfunction, which then generates more dysfunction. These forces don't operate in isolation. They interact and amplify each other. Fiscal constraints make military commitments more politically contentious. Political polarization prevents addressing fiscal problems. Alliance doubts create security vacuums that rivals fill, which then creates new commitments America can't easily sustain. The system isn't experiencing separate crises. It's experiencing a cascading failure where each weakness reinforces the others. Consider two possible trajectories. In the optimistic scenario, this crisis forces a reconstruction of consensus. Americans recognize that strategic paralysis carries existential costs. Institutional reforms make governance less dysfunctional. Fiscal policy gets serious. Alliance commitments get reaffirmed and rationalized. The system stabilizes at a new equilibrium, perhaps with fewer commitments, but ones that America can credibly maintain. In the pessimistic scenario, the cascading failures continue. Political polarization deepens. Fiscal pressures intensify. Allies increasingly hedge by making separate arrangements. Rivals grow bolder as American responses become more erratic. The gap between commitments and capabilities widens until something breaks. Either a major alliance defection, a rival making a move America can't effectively counter, or a crisis that reveals how constrained American options have become. The crucial insight is this: America's greatest weakness isn't military capacity or economic strength. It's the growing gap between its commitments and its political system's ability to honor them consistently over time. Rivals don't need to defeat America in direct confrontation. They just need to exploit the predictable unpredictability, the knowledge that American strategy might completely reverse with the next election, that domestic politics might prevent response to provocations, that fiscal constraints might force withdrawal from commitments. These aren't separate stories about political polarization, fiscal problems, and geopolitical competition. They're the same story. The story of a superpower discovering that internal dysfunction can be as strategically decisive as external pressure. And that should concern everyone, because when the system that maintained global stability for 70 years shows structural cracks, what replaces it won't emerge peacefully or predictably. The rivals who exposed this weakness aren't celebrating a victory, they're preparing for the chaos that comes when everyone realizes the emperor's strategic paralysis is permanent.